Hey guys, and today we're going to be getting into the United States and its history. So we're going to be talking about creating a nation, mainly our nation. So let's kind of connect it to your world. What do you think of when you think of U.S. history? For me, I think of the American Revolution. I think of World War I, World War II, the Civil War. I think of men like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. I think of presidents. I think of representative democracy. And although I really wasn't alive for any of those events, I still know a great deal about them, and somehow I'm able to connect in some way to some of those events. Maybe it's through relatives who served in World War II, or maybe it's understanding the history of George Washington. No matter what comes to mind, it is connected in some way to the geography. For example, the Civil War. The Civil War scarred America's landscape. And if you go to places like Gettysburg or Vicksburg, Mississippi, you're going to see what it was like. You can walk the battlefields. You can still see where the cannonballs hit. You can see where there were bullet holes and stuff like that. It still scars our geography. You can see in the land where they dug tunnels and stuff like that. The way that people choose to live on land, the movement of the people, and the interaction of cultures all played a major role in American history. So we have settling the land. The U.S. history involves many different cultures, including Native Americans, Europeans, Asians, as well as Africans. Sometimes various groups such as Native Americans and European settlers fought, but more often they learned from each other and helped to create a new American culture. So let's talk about the land, Native Americans. So how did people get to North America? You know, people came about in Africa, and they slowly spread throughout Asia and into Europe. And how did they get to North America? Did they sail here? Did they fly here? Did they swim here? Well, the most popular theory is that a couple thousand years ago, there was a giant ice age. And because of all the ice, the sea levels actually decreased. They dropped. And because of this, there was a land bridge connecting Asia, part of Alaska, to Asia. And we had people who walked across it. They were most likely nomads following their food source, and they followed it all the way down into North America. And that is where we believe the early ancestors of the Native Americans showed up from. But we don't know that for sure. It's just a theory. There are other theories as well, but it's the most popular one. All right, here's a great image of what they would have been crossing. This is in Alaska here. It gives you an idea of some of the terrain they would have had to have gone over and crossed. Pretty intense, right? You have mountains with snow everywhere. You're not only having to deal with the elements, but also the danger of animals like polar bears and things like that. All right, people eventually spread to all parts of America. We have Native Americans all the way over in Massachusetts. We have groups of Native Americans that will make their way all the way down south, down into parts of New Mexico. We also have groups that will make their way all the way down into Latin America. By the year 1500, hundreds of cultural groups lived in North America. Many lived by hunting and fishing, while others farmed. In the 1500s, Americans began to come to North America. We have essentially the Spanish showing up first, and the Spanish are essentially, at first, they're looking for the city of gold. And they're exploring the Midwest, they're in Florida, they're all over the place. And then slowly we get the British that are showing up. And they build colonies in North Carolina, they build a colony in Virginia and in Massachusetts. And they're starting to build these little settlements that are going to grow into colonies. This began a pattern of immigration into the United States from around the world. Some Europeans came looking for gold or land, others came to find religious freedom. Many Africans were brought to the colonies to work as slaves. Over time, Europeans started to develop many American colonies. So, in 1763, Great Britain defeated France in what is called the French and Indian War. To pay off war debts, Britain's rulers imposed taxes on the colonists. Now, things to consider here. The colonists in America were having to pay heavy taxes that went straight back to Britain. They were not being represented in Britain. They didn't have a representative democracy. They really didn't get a say in how that money was spent. So you're given this huge chunk of change to a ruler who doesn't even live in the same land as you. So you have a lot of people who are starting to get a little upset. Britain also passed laws to control the colonies, very strict laws on what they could do, where they could live, things like that. Colonists objected to the new laws because they had no representatives in the British lawmaking body to speak for their concerns or interests. Obviously, life is very different in Georgia than it is over in Great Britain. Okay? So, this is why people were very upset. This is eventually going to lead us to the American Revolution. In 1775, the Revolutionary War began, and in 1776, the colonies proclaimed freedom in the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson. When they signed the Declaration of Independence, they were committing high treason against the British Empire. These men who signed the Constitution, or signed the Declaration of Independence, they were very serious about this, and if they were to ever have been caught, they would have faced a severe penalty. They would have been hung to within an inch of their death, cut down, and then they would have had their lower intestines cut out and essentially grilled in front of them. After that, they would have been beheaded. So it was a very serious act, committing high treason against Great Britain. So when they did sign this, they took a very serious undertaking. By 1783, the United States had won the war against Great Britain, and we had become a new nation. The war itself is incredibly interesting. There's battles that happen all along the East Coast, anywhere from Georgia all the way up into northern New York. You know, there's battles taking place. Incredibly interesting to look at and to study, and you have to think the British Empire was one of the most powerful empires in the entire world. How did the most powerful empire in the entire world get defeated by a bunch of ragtag farmers and merchants and fishermen? It's a great question, right? So that's something you might want to look into. We're going to skip that. You can watch that on your own. The Constitution. America feared abuse of powers. They had seen what happened in the British government, and they did not want something similar to happen. So they wanted to set strict laws in place. So they developed a constitution. In 1787, leaders from 12 states met to create a new government. They wrote the Constitution of the United States, the document that is the basis for the United States government. We kind of stole some ideas from the French, and actually the French, it's very interesting, they helped fund us and they helped support us in the American Revolution. But we stole some ideas from them, such as the three branches of government. We have the legislative branch, executive branch, and the judicial branch. This was an idea that a French philosopher by the name of Montesquieu kind of created, and we heard about it and we decided, hey, we like this, let's steal it from them. The Constitution set up a federal government, a union of states with the central authority divided into three equal branches. I just talked about those three branches. You have the judicial, a branch that interprets the law and includes all the courts in the country, including the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the highest of the courts in the United States. Legislative branch, they make laws. It consists of two houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. So if you're a senator, you would be on the Senate, and if you're a congressman or woman, you would be in the House of Representatives. Each state has two senators, and the congressmen and women, it depends on the population of the state, essentially. So big states like California are going to have more congressmen and women than a small state like Rhode Island. Then you get the executive. This is probably the most popular branch that you guys have heard of. This enforces the law. It is led by the president, who is the head of the government. Now, what's often misinterpreted here is we look at the executive and we go, hey, that's where all the power is held. It's held by the president. In reality, who is making all the laws? It's a legislative. So if you're upset with laws and stuff, you need to turn that towards the legislative, and you can send your congressmen and women emails or letters. You could write them today, a letter, and they may respond to you. All right, skip that. Watch that on your own. The nation grows. Even before the war, Americans had begun to move west, to new lands out west. After the war, the U.S. gained all of Britain's territory, essentially from Canada all the way down to west of the Mississippi, so a little past Missouri. In 1803, President Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory. He bought it for dirt cheap, essentially. He bought it for nothing. France was trying to pay off their debts because they just had the French Revolution, and in order to consolidate their debts, they sold this Louisiana Territory all the way from Louisiana up to Montana. They sold it to the United States. So the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States. At this time, Jefferson decides he's going to explore this territory because we don't know a whole lot about what is out there. We need to send some cartographers, map makers. We need to send some explorers out west to find what kind of animals, geography that they would find. So they're going to send Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore the region. And to this day, we can actually track exactly where they stopped and stayed at. And it's really gross how we can track that, but we know exactly every stop that they made because they had severe stomach problems along the way. And so they had these little mercury tablets they would swallow, and it's gross, but they would essentially poop out a lot of mercury, and because of that, we can actually go through, and when there's high deposits of mercury along certain rivers or spots, we know, hey, they camped here. So we know all of their campsites all along the Mississippi, starting in St. Louis, going all the way to Seattle, essentially. It's really interesting. Their story is incredible. They obviously meet a great woman called Sacagawea, who is an absolute stud, married to this French guy who, we're not even going to mention his name because he was worthless. He didn't do a thing. Sacagawea is this stud. She has a baby along the way. They take the baby with her. She was kidnapped as a baby and ends up meeting her, I believe, brother along the way. And it's this great story, and it's really interesting to check out. But Meriwether Lewis and William Clark are the big explorers who will venture west and explore this Louisiana Territory. All right. Can you guys hear that? Okay, so we have this original 13 colonies. We slowly start to expand west, and by the end of 1803, we have all of this territory here. Eventually, we're going to get this Texas territory. We're going to get this Mexican secession territory as well, and then you have the Oregon country up here that we get from Great Britain in 1846. So you see the modern U.S., and you see what territory we once controlled, or how we slowly gained control to it. All right, you guys can play around with that on Nearpod. That's an assignment. We will worry about that later. Crisis and change. So what happens is, in the Northeast, manufacturing becomes very common. In the South, we obviously have lots of farming. The most famous farms are called plantations. Plantations typically we would have slaves working on them, and they were picking cotton, essentially. Cotton is used for fabric, such as your clothes. So it is very important because clothing is obviously very important. So we slowly get the growing pains, and eventually it leads to a civil war. From the nation's beginning, some Americans wanted slavery and some wanted to end slavery. It's really interesting as you look at our history, the people who wanted to end slavery and those that fought against and wanted to keep slaves. You get men like John Brown, who leads a raid at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He was an abolitionist. Abolitionists are people who want to free the slaves. He had had enough talks of peace, and he decided, I'm just going to take this armory, I'm going to steal a bunch of weapons, I'm going to arm slaves, we're going to have a revolution. He tried that. It ultimately failed. But this is kind of the powder keg. This is a little spark, and it helps unite something that will eventually lead to the South seceding, and ultimately Abraham Lincoln going after the South, and we get the 13th Amendment, which eventually will free the slaves. Okay, So in 1860, Abraham Lincoln is a Northerner. He hated slavery. He was elected president. In response, the South is very upset. They secede. The fighting breaks out, and the Civil War begins in 1861. Okay, at first, the South is doing incredibly well. They have incredible leaders such as Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee. They're both military geniuses. However, the North has manufacturing, and they can mass produce weapons, ammunition, and they essentially are able to use more of their industrial might to help defeat the South in 1865. About a week after the war, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated at Ford's Theater. So, as the U.S. continued to gain more territory, the economy also began to grow. Immigration poured into U.S. cities. This required more food and supplies to be produced. Factories replaced handmade manufacturing. In 1869, the first Transcontinental Railroad crossed the continent from coast to coast. This made it easier to ship goods to the market. It took originally 3 months to cross from New York to California. The Transcontinental Railroad cut that time down by a lot. It took about a week riding the Transcontinental Railroad to get from New York to California. Today, I can get from New York to California in a couple hours on a plane. Pretty impressive, right? All right, when World War II started in Europe in 1914, most of the Americans wanted to stay out of it. Then Germany killed many civilians by the sinking of numerous ships. An example is the Lusitania. Germany then sent a telegram called the Zimmermann Telegraph to Mexico. The Zimmermann Telegraph said, hey, Mexico, start a war with the United States and we'll help you. And the United States found out about this. We weren't happy, so we decided to go after Germany. The economy was doing well until the 1920s. After the war in 1929, the stock market crashed. Most people lost their money. They lost their jobs. Unemployment spiked to 25%. For example, unemployment right now in the United States is sitting at 7%. It was at one point 25% during the Great Depression. We have it nowhere near as bad as it was at one point. So in the late 1930s, we get a war that starts in Europe again. It starts in 1939 with Hitler invading Poland, and then he goes into France. The U.S. doesn't get involved until the end of 1941, December 7th, 1941, when Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. Here is the USS Arizona. Unfortunately, almost 2,000 men died almost instantly on this one ship. A bomb went through, crashed through the main deck and actually landed where all the other bombs were stored on the ship, artillery, I'm sorry. And it exploded, and the ship actually came out of the water and crashed back down. Almost 2,000 men died. There are still people today who lived through Pearl Harbor. There's not many World War II survivors left. My old neighbor was one, and he unfortunately passed away about 2 weeks ago. But there's a lot of World War II vets that are still out there, and their stories are really interesting if you ever get the chance to listen to some of them. After World War II, the U.S. becomes a world power. Okay, we have the nuclear bomb. We then get into a space race with the Soviet Union, which is incredibly interesting. And then, unfortunately, on September 11, 2001, terrorists flew airplanes into the two World Trades, the two Twin Towers, and the Pentagon, as well as they attempted to hijack another Flight 93 and crashed it into the White House or the Capitol building, but they took that plane back. About 3,000 people died. Incredibly sad story. There's incredibly interesting stories of people who lived through these events, and their firsthand perspective of what it was like is very interesting and sad. It was a sad turning point for the U.S. There you have what the Twin Towers were, incredibly tall buildings. Today, obviously, they are no more. You can go here and there's the remnants of the base of both towers. There's a new building next to where it once was, and there is a museum in the ground there. Okay. All right, we're done. I hope you enjoyed some of this. That was U.S. history in like 15 minutes. It's a lot to take in, I know. All right, have a good day.